The roles that we adopted in dysfunctional families often still influence our behaviour in adulthood, and many of us keep repeating the same dysfunctional dynamic, feeling frustrated, not knowing why this keeps continuing. So, a big part of our recovery and healing is recognizing our predominant roles from childhood. Because becoming aware of this programming and how it affects us today allows us to make more empowering choices. So, in this video, I want to tell you more about the role of the lost child, also called the forgotten or invisible child. And I think a lot of people will relate to this familiar experience of becoming invisible or lost within a narcissistic family. And I really want to clarify this point, that this information is not about adopting yet another label and continuing to feel like a victim of a narcissistic parent or a dysfunctional family, but it's about recognizing whether an unconscious pattern of behavior still has an influence on who you are today. It's about waking up, growing up, and letting go of everything that we no longer need to repeat. So this child is often invisible to the parents and is severely neglected, which includes being emotionally abandoned and consistently invalidated for their feelings. The invisible child grows up feeling irrelevant and like they don't belong anywhere. They may be very sensitive and caring and loving. They are quick to retreat and stay away from any family drama, and they appear unaffected by the conflict. They pretend that they can handle anything, and they're very agreeable, soft-spoken, very kind-hearted, and basically will do anything to avoid unnecessary attention. The narcissistic parent will reinforce their conflict-averse behavior and reward them for being avoidant. And that's because the lost child's job in a narcissistic family is to maintain the illusion that all is well. Everything is just fine. They may grow up being called a dreamer or the quiet one in the family. And this lost and invisible child is completely unseen by the narcissistic parent. In fact, the narcissistic parent is preoccupied. They don't recognize their children's needs. So as an example, this child may go to school in clothes that they've outgrown or shoes that don't fit anymore, and they may become targets of bullying because their basic needs have been neglected by their parents. So they grow up feeling inherently unworthy, undeserving, and unlovable. Beneath their quiet, gentle-natured exterior, they suppress deep feelings of powerlessness, anger, of not being good enough, a deep sadness about being overlooked, feeling invisible and ashamed. And on some level, they do intuit the complete absence of a loving connection, something that does not emanate from a narcissistic parent. This role is also very common for children of alcoholics. Another thing that comes to mind is the narcissistic parent's use of the silent treatment, which can last for hours, days, or weeks, and it is such a severe punishment to bear, particularly for an invisible child, because this confirms their invisibility. They may have been punished for expressing their needs, and they learn early on that reasoning or asking for help will fall on deaf ears at best. They know that their requests will be invalidated, so they conclude that becoming invisible ensures their safety and separation from the pain. They don't want to draw any attention to themselves, and sometimes kind of go grey rock really early on. And they desperately long for connection, but are afraid of it. They're absolutely terrified of using their voice and being heard because they've observed repeatedly what the narcissistic parent does to the scapegoat of the family who actually speaks out about problems. So the child in this role will prefer to keep the peace and avoid getting into trouble, is easily hurt, carries a lot of anxiety, and comes across as angelic. They're very shy, polite, and very nice. And the invisible child is very aware of the pressure in the family, so they try to alleviate the strain by minimizing their own needs, by pretending they don't matter, by being inconspicuous, and distracting themselves, blending in, not causing any trouble. So they may study a lot, they may love to read, the library might be their second home, they may prefer to fade into the background. They're fantasizers, they're dreamers, they may watch a lot of TV, and they just want to be away and not a burden on their mum and dad. So they'll disappear, hide from the chaos into activities, and they generally exhibit extremely introverted tendencies. And the invisible child feels very uncomfortable around others. And we often grow up forming deeper bonds with pets than with people. Or we may have one long-term best friend. Simply being around others can cause us to feel panic because we don't know how to express emotions or how to socialize. We feel very uncomfortable with the possibility of having to deal with any disagreements or confrontations, and so we prefer isolation. So it's not surprising that we often grow into adults who pretend to be super independent and we behave like we don't need anyone. But the painful truth is that relationships scare us. We bury our own emotional disconnection and we may come across as being aloof. We wall up, shut down, or feel very awkward relating to other humans. And we often feel terrified of any kind of intimacy. Adults who were predominantly invisible children have extremely low self-esteem, low self-worth, and they have issues with self-image. And that's because we were programmed by the narcissistic parent for invisibility. And this is just my opinion, but I believe that the lost child will be the one who will be particularly challenged with codependency. And they will often develop drug and alcohol addictions, food addictions, because they swallow their pain in order to maintain the family peace and to put on this lovely external appearance. And sadly, they may also be very challenged with having a lot of suicidal thoughts. The narcissistic parent may have mocked us for being so sensitive or withdrawn, and our emotions were consistently dismissed or ignored, and the narcissistic parent may have talked over us or pretended that we didn't exist because their needs were more important and their views on everything were the only thing that mattered. So the narcissistic parent was an emotionally absent parent. And we learn these roles in our family of origin. So when we grow up, we continue interacting with the world in these styles. So we may unknowingly seek people out who don't see us because that feels normal for us. And for those adults who feel most familiar with the role of being the lost child, they will be most challenged with setting boundaries with their narcissistic parent. Remember that the lost child's role was to keep the peace and make everything appear nice, to appease the narcissistic parent. So the narcissistic parent will particularly amp up their guilt trips to disable this child from ever growing up, from individuating and separating from their control. They will foster their dependency, in fact, encourage and reward their codependent behavior. The adult lost child will most likely continue to be manipulated by their aging narcissistic parent because they'll still have that role to play, which is maintaining their narcissistic parent's illusion of being a great parent. And that is exactly what the lost child supplies to the narcissistic parent, and this is why they don't want to let them go. They'll behave possessively and demand they remain at their beck and call, even if it means destroying their adult child's career, marriage, friendships. They'll coerce the lost child, who's now an adult, to remain in their shadow, still acting entitled and having unreasonable expectations. See, it's the scapegoat who's most likely to leave a narcissistic family dynamic and heal their emotional wounds. They have more of a rebellious nature, whereas the lost child will be more easily manipulated due to their sensitive, caring, and complacent nature. They are much more likely to feel ashamed and really bad after common comments by their narcissistic parent like, "It's all your fault, I'm not happy." Or other things that you may hear is, "I can't live without you." And you'll also notice that they become very jealous and threatened if the adult lost child is preoccupied with activities they actually enjoy. And you'll hear comments like, "Why are you doing this to me?" And they will hold you responsible for their happiness or unhappiness. And until you learn to discern the difference between this type of toxic shaming, they will continue to control your life with this unhealthy guilt. And let's just clarify something here. A loving parent wouldn't repeatedly and consistently intimidate or guilt trip their own adult child simply for wanting to live their own authentic life. But to a narcissistic parent, their child's authenticity is seen as a threat. It means that they will lose control of their supply. So it's really important to recognize these typical behaviors that just keep repeating, and it's all about control. And as we know, in dysfunctional families, you were never allowed to be your authentic self. You had to play a role to survive. So we went through periods in our childhood playing these different roles. But some of us spent more time playing one predominant role, and that role shaped our personality. And of course, it also comes with us developing certain strengths and also being challenged by particular weaknesses. And in the case of the lost child, they usually grow up with really great creative and artistic abilities. They can become great authors, writers, where they're able to express and process a lot of their emotions in a safe way. And the areas that we are challenged by are, of course, confronting our fear of being visible in the world. So if this was your predominant role in a narcissistic family, here are some questions to ask yourself. Do you intentionally avoid all conflict and prefer not to talk about your feelings? Do you have a strong need for validation, approval, and permission? Do you know what your needs are? Do you feel like you're a burden? Do you attract relationships where you feel neglected, invisible, or abandoned? Do you find it difficult to face reality? So these are all really important questions to ask yourself to help you awaken to whether you are still repeating an old pattern in adulthood. So by consciously identifying this, it can help set you free. And it's a huge relearning for us once we identify this. It's about allowing ourselves to feel again. It's about befriending our emotions and making peace with our inner child. It's about recognizing our needs, asking for what we want, and speaking up on our own behalf. So I encourage you to make yourself more visible, participate in life, find ways in which you feel a sense of belonging. And this is how we start to break these old patterns of childhood dysfunctional programming. I definitely never expected my childhood allocated role of invisible child to affect my behavior like it did when I became an adult. I was always extremely sensitive to criticism and any perceived potential signs of rejection. It was easier for me to be avoidant, and I would intentionally isolate myself from people because socializing was awkward and painful, and escaping into fantasy land was my preferred place to be. So invisible children feel forgotten, and they are fearful of making decisions and taking initiative. So as an adult, these are our challenges. We may still desperately want to please our parent, and in adulthood, we may still be attracting very abusive partners who repeat the narcissistic parent's abusive and severely neglectful behavior toward us. And yes, coming to consciousness can be a painful process, but it's nowhere near as painful as continuously repeating unconscious patterns of behavior that are not really us. They are remnants of a childhood program, a role that we were allocated, which perhaps was necessary to help us cope and survive. However, now in adulthood, the effects of these roles may have a detrimental influence on our quality of life. If the description of this role resonated for you, or you recognize certain aspects of this role, then I encourage you to bring it up with your therapist or in a support group. And there's a lot of really great information out there, and understanding this more deeply can really help us gain a better idea about ourselves and why we feel or react the way we do. When we understand these roles and these dysfunctional programs, we can stop blaming and reacting and start responding and being proactive, authentic participants in our life.